right. Politics and the Bible. An exciting topic.
Dun, dun, dun.
Dun, dun, dun. I personally have generally hated politics for most of my life,
This is true.
but you have had a different relationship to them.
I have. I've always found politics to be interesting. And I suppose I can share that I grew up a Rush baby. I don't know
Yes.
if you're familiar with this term,
I
but
was not until just a while ago.
so my dad really enjoyed listening to Rush Limbaugh, the conservative political commentator who was on the radio in the 90s and 2000s when I was growing up. My dad would turn it on when we were in the car or during lunch breaks, and he would have conversations with me about what we were listening to. And so that's what piqued my interest and has really sparked an interest that's continued to today. I really enjoy listening about politics.
Yeah, you certainly do. I can affirm this, being married to you. Whereas I had such a different relationship to politics. In particular, I think last night when we were kind of talking about this a bit, we said that the Bush versus Gore was the first presidential election we really engaged with. Like, I think I remembered Bob Dole versus Clinton, but I was so young it wasn't really important. My recollection was that, you'd literally go like play at the lunch break with your friends out on the soccer field. And then you'd come in and your social studies teacher would make you write an essay about the election. And in like 45 minutes, they'd turn people who'd been best friends, just an hour before into arch enemies now that they knew they were voting, or their parents really were voting Democrat
Right.
or Republican. And I hated that. And so I always thought, well, politics is not for me, and seems to cause so much discord where otherwise people seem to mostly get along. And
So why bother?
yeah, I guess that was kind of my take on it for a long time. It's not my take on it anymore, but I did not have a nice introduction to it. But you've always enjoyed engaging with it.
But I really enjoy podcasts.
Yeah.
I really enjoy podcasts.
Do you listen to All Truth is God's Truth?
That is probably my favorite podcast.
Oh, well, why wouldn't it be?
I know that people might find this odd, but I find politics almost relaxing to listen to. I don't find it stressful. I find it engaging for a couple of reasons. One, because, I don't know, there's a lot of big problems in America and the world, and there's not much I personally can do about them. And for some reason, listening to these big problems, I don't know, it's an escape. The same way I think people enjoy listening to drama that the Kardashians are having or other celebrities. It's just interesting, and it's not your problem, and somehow that makes it feel better. That's kind of how I feel about politics. In addition, I'm a closeted judgmental person, and so it's an outlet for me to kind of like, well, that's a stupid policy, or make kind of blanket statements and thoughts about things.
Again, things that are far removed from
me in my everyday life. Like, I don't talk about politics with my friends, and I think we'll get into why that's a testy subject. But for me personally, just in my house listening to podcasts about politics, I find relaxing and enjoyable, and that's probably not typical.
Yeah, certainly it's never been the case for me. But I think the fact that your family, especially you and your dad, would engage on the subject.
Right. It wasn't something that we just passively consumed. It was definitely conversation starters. And so even now, I know I say I'm a judgy person, and I think that's somewhat fun, but I think I'm still a thoughtful person about those things. And it's just an avenue to kind of form and solidify certain opinions that I have. And as I get older, it's interesting seeing how those change from, the early days of fifth grade essays on Bush versus Gore to as a tax-paying citizen, thoughts have changed.
Yeah, it's a bit more nuanced.
Yeah.
Or impactful, at least.
Right.
But so I suspect, I think we all agree, politics has become increasingly difficult to talk about in the past couple of years to a couple of decades. But I suspect it's always been a difficult subject matter. Like, I think Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton weren't just like a one-off case of like, well, those guys were off the deep end. They shot each other over political differences. But probably everyone had strong political disagreements throughout most of history, or at least most of American history. Where we have a government where the people can weigh in on the politics.
Yeah.
And other political societies where, well, the emperor is emperor. What are you going to do about it?
Exactly.
It's not going to be such a hot button issue, maybe, or either you're a zealot who wants to undo that political system, or you're just kind of going to live with it.
Yeah.
But anyway, I assume that to some degree throughout history, it's been a difficult thing to talk about because people do disagree, and disagreeing with friends especially is really hard. And so when you go to work with folks that don't agree with you, but you still want to get along with them, and you even still enjoy their company, either you avoid the subject or maybe you talk about it more amicably than we have in these past couple of decades. But yeah, it seems to have gotten worse. In particular, it seems to have evolved this moral dimension to it.
Yes.
Where if you fall in certain political camps, those outside the camp might judge you as a genuinely bad person.
Right.
I guess I'll very quickly say, maybe there's, I'm going to caveat there's an asterisk ahead of time, that maybe there's some merit to that, and that what they're saying about that camp is like horrible stuff. And if that stuff were true, then yeah, maybe, this group is actually advocating for straight up xenophobia. They're endorsing it. Let's just not like anyone who doesn't look or talk or think like us. Then in that case, yes, maybe you could make the case, that's not a particularly generous person. They actually are maybe got some moral problems to them. But it seems to me that more often than not, the people in that camp aren't really advocating for that.
Right.
That's like a hyperbolic reductio ad absurdum, if you will.
Yeah.
Of like taking some facet of their argument and extrapolating it to an extreme, and then saying, that's what they really want, and then critiquing it, calling them immoral. So then, if we're talking about political camps, I feel like it might be helpful to at least outline what we mean by, in broad brushstrokes, by some of these camps. And some of the language I find most helpful is liberal versus conservative. I'm curious, how were you introduced to the idea of liberal and conservative in your growing up?
Yeah, I guess kind of a broad brushstroke when first introduced to that concept is conservative, wants to keep things kind of the way they are, whereas liberal might want to make more change in order to bring about a better society or to bring about some good, whereas conservatives are less likely to muck about with systems and instead kind of try to get the government off people's backs and let people be people and do what they're going to do, instead of trying to use systems to produce a certain outcome that liberals might think is a positive good.
Yeah, I think that if that's how you were introduced to it, that's definitely a more nuanced version than I was introduced to. I feel like mine was all about, literally just like, look at the word conserve. That's it. That's all you need to know about a conservative. They don't want anything to change.
Right.
And a liberal is all about changing things. Thus, it's almost in like definition by opposition. If they're not conservative, then they just want things to change. Which always seemed odd to me.
I think small government has always been a part of my definition of conservative.
Yeah,
smaller.
A preference for smaller, less
a
powerful
preference for
governments.
less powerful government, more spread out.
Yeah, that makes sense. Certainly, as I've grown and learned more about conservatism, an appreciation for documents like the Constitution is pretty clearly on the conservative side of things. In fact, I definitely had friends growing up, and definitely still know people now who would look at the Constitution and mock it, and that's fine. They can mock it, I guess, but regard it as like an inherent evil of sorts. Like it's actually an obstacle to achieving good things,
yes.
right?
Whereas I think in my mind that's like a good thing.
Good, right?
Slow
There's
down.
an obstacle, right? You want to create some system that I don't think is good. The Constitution prevents you from doing that. Good.
Yeah.
Like you have to get buy-in from everyone to create this through a constitutional amendment process or something like that. But yeah, so I don't think those are actually exactly the right defining boundaries for conservative versus liberal.
Yeah. So what would you say?
Yeah. So good. I get to talk about one of my intellectual heroes.
I know.
I know you know this is coming. So for those of you who don't know, actually, if you listen to the trailer of All Truth is God's Truth, I think it's still in there. I talk about how actually my path back towards Orthodox faith, Orthodox meaning just correct and proper faith, was via economics, and the economist that I was reading that brought this about is a man named Thomas Sowell, who is just a very brilliant thinker, on the conservative side. I don't think he'd actually call himself an intellectual. He usually doesn't like that word. But a very bright man who's written an awful lot about an awful lot of things, but is technically an economist. And anyway, at one point he was asked, what's a conservative? What makes someone a conservative or not? And the definition he provided I thought was just so telling and so useful, in that it was, if you look at the world around you and you think that all of the problems that you see in the world are the result of a system or an institution that is somehow corrupted or flawed and could be tweaked with just a few changes, or maybe you put the right people in power with the right principles, or whatever it is, like there's a system at work. And if the system were perfected, then the world would be perfect. Then you're liberal. Whereas the conservative looks at the world around them and they say, oh no, even with a perfect system, there'd still be evil in the world, because the ultimate source of evil is not a government or a flawed government or a institution like the church or whatever it may be that a liberal might point at and say, there's the source of my problems. The source of all problems ultimately is the heart of man, because the heart of man is corrupted and has problems in it. And that if you view the world that way, then you're really thinking like a conservative. And I thought that was extremely helpful for a multitude of reasons, both because I think it's more instructive about what is really in the mind of a political thinker in each side of the camp, more so than, well, I just don't want anything to change. Like, well, change from what to
Right.
what? What country are you in?
Yeah.
Such that you could be thought of as a conservative or not. And the fact that you redefine conservative just depending on what country you're in doesn't seem like a particularly helpful definition. So, yes,
Yeah,
I think
so
you're pulling up something.
That definition reminds me of a quote that I previously misattributed to Jefferson. It is actually James Madison,
Okay.
if men were angels. So this is from Federalist 51, I believe, which was written by James Madison. And it says, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. So I feel as though Madison is coming from a more conservative as opposed to liberal mindset here, in that he's acknowledging that, hey, if the problem didn't lie in men's hearts,
Mm-hmm. Great.
we wouldn't even need a government.
We wouldn't even need
we wouldn't
a
need
government.
systems. Like, we would just treat each other beautifully.
The right way all the time.
But acknowledging that we are not angels.
Yeah.
Therefore, we need a system that's going to have checks and balances and check itself.
No, I especially like that second sentence, right? Like, because it's easy to go, oh, if men were but angels, we wouldn't need a government. And go, oh, okay, yes, I get it. So because we're flawed individuals, we need a government.
Mm-hmm.
But then he points out, yeah, but who's going to run the government, right? If you
Yeah.
had angels running the government, that would fix your problem
Perfect.
too, right?
Yeah,
like
yeah.
you'd have evil men, but a perfect government would step in and take the exactly correct recourse
Yeah.
every time an evil man or woman does an evil thing.
Mm-hmm. So in general, conservatives seem to be a little more pessimistic about things,
Yeah.
whereas liberals are maybe a little overly optimistic, perhaps.
Yeah. Thinking back to when I was introduced to, I think, the flawed definition of conservative, the philosophers that at least I was introduced to that kind of epitomized that was the John Locke on the liberal
Mm-hmm.
side versus Thomas Hobbes on the more conservative side, if you will, just viewing the nature of man
Right.
as flawed versus maybe not perfect, but
Pretty good.
not the source of all evil. Right?
Yeah.
Whereas like I think I ultimately, as weird as it is to say, I agree with Hobbes on that. It might be true. It might be true that I actually do agree with Hobbes. At the very least, I think that type of mindset agrees better with the Bible.
Yeah.
And if ultimately, this is a podcast about the Bible and Scripture and what God teaches us and how we can make sense of all the things that are true, I think that's a better understanding of the human condition.
Mm-hmm.
That you go back to Genesis chapter 1 through 3 and you see a world that is clearly meant to be perfect in some sense, that it's not full of corruption, it's not full of evil. God looks at it, and every time he does, he says it's good. And by
Right.
the end, he says it's very good. And then something goes awry. And the thing that goes awry somehow screws up our hearts. and you have shame where there shouldn't be shame, and you have discord and blaming where there shouldn't be discord and blaming, and within another chapter you have brothers killing each other, and like all the evil things that you can possibly imagine all unfold very shortly after this entrance of sin into the world.
You have Cain building the first city.
Does Cain build the first city?
I think so. And I think there's something about Cain being the bringer of culture and society.
And thus society is corrupted.
Didn't have a great start, maybe.
Cain lay with his wife, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Enoch. Cain was then building a city, and
Yeah.
he named it after his son, Enoch. Certainly it's the first city mentioned.
Yep.
You're right. Okay, so that's a really interesting point. That like Cain, the first brother-killing man,
Fratricide.
is the one who builds the first city mentioned in the Bible. So
I
there's
think another example of a desire for humans to implement systems is Babel.
Yeah.
And taking it on ourselves to, we can build a staircase
Reconnect
to God.
Yeah.
Sure, we've been kicked out of the garden, but we could just build a staircase right up to heaven ourselves.
Yeah. Which a good hermeneutics note to connect there is like the Hebrew of Bob El
Mm-hmm.
is Bob is gate
Oh.
and El is God. It's the gateway to God.
Wow.
Yeah. So they're
What,
it's quite literal.
what hubris to think
Mhm,
that. Yeah. Why not?
We'll just we'll reconnect ourselves to God
Yeah.
and kind of take that throne.
Right.
No, that's a good point. That you're right. There are other examples in Scripture. Babel being a really clear one, and the Cain one being more subtle. But I hadn't appreciated that. There's something corrupted and messed up in society, but that the origin point of it seems to be man.
Right.
We did something wrong in the garden, and that's corrupted everything we've done ever since.
Yeah.
So in the end, I think I land on conservative political philosophy, and that obviously influences how I vote, etc. But it is more pessimistic. But at the same time,
I don't know. Whenever I accuse you of being a pessimist, you're like, I'm not a pessimist.
I'm a realist. Yeah,
So
exactly. For starters, I'd say that. I'd say like, well, if that's the case, if humans, all of us, really are corrupted,
Yes.
then yes. But the other thing, I think, in a certain sense, it's more optimistic in that it doesn't break us up into good people, bad people camps. It's not, well, if you're in that one political camp, you're a bad person. It says, wrong, buddy. We're all bad.
Team bad.
Exactly. We're all team bad, and we all need saving. But so in a certain sense, it's almost more unifying. You then have to strategize what's a good system for constraining the evil that will come about because it's everywhere all the time.
Right.
You can't get rid of it. So you have to architect those principles and those policies, but you don't have to just identify the bad people and get rid of them.
Yeah.
Because it's everyone. Well, what is the Christian's relationship to government then? So a government obviously must exist unless you're an anarchist and you think.
Well, in the Bible, we've got several different examples of different types
different
of governments. Right?
Yep.
We have Old Testament examples
Yep.
of the Hebrew Israelite slaves in Egypt.
In Egypt. I don't think that's endorsed as a
No.
particularly positive government.
No, that one, not so great. But then we have the Davidic kingdom, Israel and Judah, and then you have submission to Babylon. When
Yep.
Babylon takes over, you have the example of Daniel doing, and the people are told to do well there.
Yeah, Jeremiah specifically says,
Mhm.
seek the prosperity of Babylon.
And then moving into New Testament, I guess generally we're talking about Rome.
Yeah, where you're still in an empire.
Yeah.
It's a different empire with slightly
Right.
different political dynamics, but and you're not really just slaves who've been removed. You're part of a province, a Roman province. And you're right. There's loads of different governing structures that God's people find themselves living in throughout the history of the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And although one of them is, in a sense, set up by God,
Right.
it is.
It's almost set up begrudgingly.
Well, so I was going to say, you jump straight to David. I would have said before that, like especially with Moses.
Judges.
Well, I'd go to Moses first, but the judges as follow-ons to Moses. That it's a theocracy.
Mhm.
It's meant to be a theocracy, and we should unpack that word a bit. In that today, the word theocracy is used to describe places like certain factions in Iran, where you want a religious clergy to be the governing authorities. And while in a sense that was the case in ancient Israel, like Moses, you could say, was a religious clergy, I guess. And he was clearly the highest authority in the Israelite camp. But it was ultimately God.
He's hearing the voice of God.
Exactly. Which, if you're you're a secular person, you're like, well, that's just beeswax. Like,
Yeah.
they're just making stuff up and using it to enforce whatever policies they want. But the concept, at least, is that it is God who is ruling, and that he's ruling through Moses. And in the period of the Judges, there is no clear, it seems, coherent government.
Right.
It's just each tribe doing what it can to survive, and then at certain critical junctures, God raises up a prophet or a judge, in this case, to intervene and to act on his behalf. But then, yes, then you get to a monarchy, which looks just like the governments surrounding them. Like, yes, it's a carbon copy in terms of its governing structure, and it is kind of, in a sense, set up begrudgingly. But in all of that, God uses it as like an or at least in the monarchy and in the period before, it's used to teach Israel about kind of the relationship they're to have to him as the supreme ruler and authority over them. But anyway, so in all of those different circumstances, we find God giving the same basic guidance, but it works out in different ways in terms of how should God's people relate to these governing authorities. If we agree with the Bible's basic views that yes, the problem in the world is ultimately from the heart of man, then what should a government be doing, and how should God's people relate to that? Let's pull up the Jeremiah passage, because that was a really good example you had, where you would think that if God's people had just been conquered, their temple had just been destroyed, they were being drawn out into exile, into a pagan place, and about to be told to do pagany things, that God's advice would be like, don't do it. Like, resist with every ounce that you have in you. But that's not what we find. In Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 4 and following, we read, "This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there and do not decrease. Also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you in exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper." So you have God explicitly saying to his people, yes, I'm carrying you to a pagan land with pagan practices, but seek its prosperity.
Yeah, you don't have Daniel the anarchist zealot trying to bring down Babylon from within.
I really like Daniel the anarchist zealot. Please, let's make that a thing. We also find a few other places where the Bible specifically comments on kind of what the role of government is in generic terms.
Well, or giving advice to Christians about what are they supposed to do or behave in relationship to the government that they find themselves under.
Yep. So if we looked at, for example, Romans chapter 13, we would read that everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities, for as there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, he who rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers do not terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and he will commend you. For he is God's servant to do you good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword for nothing. He is God's servant, an agent of wrath, to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also because of conscience. So that's controversial, because I think you could take that and just say, well, thus every government that has ever existed, God instituted it. It has God's rubber stamp of approval. And I think even the Bible examples make it pretty clear that that's not the case, in the sense that God doesn't approve of every government ever and all of the policies that they carry about. In fact, Babylon itself is used as an example of go and seek its prosperity,
Mhm.
but the way that they've carried out their military campaigns means they're my next target. Right? I'm using them to judge you now, but I will ultimately judge them as well.
And in that instance, we have several examples of individuals standing up to the government.
Yes.
So we have the example of Daniel, who is very wise and is seeking wisdom for the king, who he calls on him to interpret his dreams for him, and Daniel provides that service. And the king is very pleased and finds him very wise and wants him to be one of his advisors.
Yeah, so that's a good example of maybe what we mean by submit to the government. The government calls upon you for service, and you willingly provide that service, so long as it doesn't violate your conscience of what God asks you to do.
And Daniel has some examples of where it did violate his conscience. So early on, when he's quite young, he refuses to eat some of the food that is offered to him.
Yeah, which is a little unclear exactly what the offense in the food is.
But still, he makes a stand about it.
But for some reason, it's offensive, and he decides, I'm not going to eat this food.
Right. And then later, somewhat trumped up charges, he says, I'm not going to pray to the king alone. I'm going to continue my worship, and is thrown into the lion's den as a result. So
yes, so but at the very least, yeah, of course, we see Daniel then clearly drawing a line of, well, if you're going to ask me to go against my God,
right,
then no.
Yeah.
So an obvious example from tragic, somewhat recent world history, like the Nazi government was, of course, the governing authority in Germany in particular, but eventually major parts of Europe throughout World War II. So I don't know exactly what are the defining lines for what does it look like to submit to government in that case look like. Maybe it's a case where it is so evil that you don't participate in any meaningful way at all. But at the very least, it's a government that's pursuing such evil policies that where those policies are clearly against God's words and moral standards, we're not expected to just go along with them just because Romans chapter 13 says submit to the government.
Right.
We have plenty of examples where there's civil disobedience from a particular Daniel, or earlier Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, in terms of also being told to bow down and worship pagan deities and refusing to do so, even though the consequence was to be thrown into a furnace.
Or even older, the example of the Hebrew midwives told by Pharaoh that should they help deliver male Hebrew slave children, that they are to kill them, they disobey.
Yeah, they disobey.
Or they even lie.
Yeah, they disobey. They lie to Egyptian
Officials
pharaohs,
reporting,
or Egyptian
agents, yep.
And they are rewarded, according to the text, for that civil disobedience.
Yeah.
So it has God's mark of approval that this is an evil thing. Not going along with it is a good thing, and they're blessed as a result of that. So our conscience needs to be clear in whatever our submission to government looks like. And it's interesting, I'm being struck by the fact that, well, then you got to know God's word really well to know, okay, where is this boundary that I need to be careful to stick to? Yeah. I'm sure that in the moment, or from our perspective, with a broad amount of religious and political liberty, it's easy to think, oh, great, well, I'll just do what feels right.
Yeah.
Whereas in those types of circumstances where your life is on the line, you should probably have a really clear picture in your head of what that line is, such that you know where not to transgress. There's other passages, even in the New Testament, that talk about similar things. We could have said something about Romans in the context in which it's written. It's not always super easy to date the book of Romans, but it's not so hard to date the writings of Peter if you're a sane person and you believe that Peter wrote 1st and 2nd Peter. Side note, not every biblical scholar believes that. In fact, probably a large fraction of secular biblical scholarship believes 1st and 2nd Peter are both pseudonymous, or at least 2nd Peter, if not 1st as well.
Well, Silvanus probably helped. Silvanus.
Yeah.
By Silvanus, the faithful brother, as I regard him, I have written briefly to you, exhorting and declaring that this is the one true grace of God.
Yeah. I think that's
maybe somebody helped him with the finer details of Greek.
Sure.
I think we can say it was from Peter.
Yes. At the very least, First Peter seems to claim to genuinely be written by the person Peter the Apostle. So I think we affirm that as the reality. In which case, the history of what's going on in the world right now when Peter is writing is that first terrible wave of persecution under Emperor Nero. And Peter himself is in prison. Peter is about to be executed, although he may not exactly realize that yet. Many Christians are being executed according to external testimony from Scripture, and allusions in the text seem to describe some of those terrible practices of actually burning Christians as part of their punishment. But even in that context, in chapter 2, verse 13 and following, we read, "Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every authority instituted among men, whether to the king," that would be the emperor, "as the supreme authority, or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish men. Live as free men, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as servants of God."
I think those words coming from Peter gives the words some more flavor, some more weight, because we have examples of Peter walking this line between submitting to authorities, but also standing up to authority.
Yeah.
So we have an example in Acts where the Sanhedrin are upset with Peter and John and what they've been doing in the temple. So the Sanhedrin was an authority, a Jewish
Local Jewish
leaders.
Political authority authorized by Rome, but not Roman.
Right.
Yeah.
So they didn't have the same authority.
As the Roman government.
But they did have some. And they were able to imprison Peter and John.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm in Acts chapter 4, verses 18. "Then they, the Sanhedrin, called them, Peter and John, in again and commanded them not to speak or teach at all the name of Jesus. But Peter and John replied, 'Which is right in God's eyes, to listen to you or to him? You be the judges. As for us, we cannot help speaking about what we have seen and heard.'" So while you have Peter giving this advice generally to his recipients of this letter to submit, we have an example where he is pushing back on an authority that is telling him to stop talking about Jesus.
Yeah.
And Peter is saying, "I can't do that."
I can't abide by that command. Yeah, that's his version of Daniel agreeing to go to the lion's den.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it is pretty wild. Wow, what a crazy life Peter had there, right? Not only that he has this example from earlier in his life, but even then, at the very end, right, as he's about to die, he's still writing to people saying, submit to the authorities, even though those authorities are clearly doing evil
And
things.
acknowledging that there's going to be suffering,
Yep.
but that suffering is not in vain.
There's going to be suffering. That suffering is not in vain. And that if you go back to Acts, that yes, there are boundaries to what it means to submit. And that if the government asks you to do something that is contrary to God's revealed will in his word, you don't follow that.
Right.
So we talked earlier about how politics has certainly taken on this kind of moral dimension. Perhaps part of the solution of that is, at least on the conservative mindset side, as well. Yeah, you're right. There are bad people involved in politics. In fact, we're all bad, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's part of the problem, is that all of us are evil. And so we need good institutions that restrain that evil. Or as James Madison put it, right?
Yeah.
You could solve all these problems if you
If
just
we were
had perfect people
Right.
either being governed
But
or
let's
in the
assume
government.
we don't.
But given that we don't, we need a way to constrain the evils of
And constrain
Men.
people who get power.
exactly constrain both the evil that's committed by citizens,
Mm-hmm.
as most of the comments in the scripture we just read were about,
Right.
but also to constrain the evil of the government, which is maybe not such institutional reality for many of the governments in the Bible, where the emperor is a supreme power.
Right.
What checks and balances are there on his power?
Yeah.
Not a lot. But that's kind of why the American Revolution had some of the philosophy it does. Is it's looking back toward the Republican era of ancient Rome and Greece, and looking at that as a model to be emulated, rather than the imperial era. So yeah, checks and balances like that are going to work in your favor to restrain the potential evils of those governments. But anyway, so maybe some of the solution to Well, are there good people and bad people? Yeah, there are bad people. We're all bad people. But if you have such a strong view of politics that you think that your politics make you a good person or a bad person, you've kind of started to make that part of your identity, right? Like we all want to be good people.
Right.
No one wants to say, oh, I want to be the evil guy.
Or I made a good decision when I voted that way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so by viewing politics so strongly, maybe we're starting to wrap that up into our identity.
Mm-hmm.
And for the Christian, that level of identity kind of needs to be held pretty far away, I think,
Right.
from our government.
Yes.
Especially because
Governments will come and go. Our identity is solidly in Christ.
yes. And because like you see throughout, as we described earlier, throughout biblical history, there's all these different governments and governing structures. But God describes his own relationship to us in terms of those governing structures and basically says that's where your ultimate political
Right.
allegiance lies. Not to the United States, not to Rome, not to Greece, not even to this fallen king of Israel that's made all these terrible decisions. Your allegiance to me as one of God's people is in fact potentially to rebuke that king if I call
Right.
you to do that, because I am the ultimate king over all of those things.
So I think as Christians engaging in a political world, we can take hope and confidence from that and hopefully not have fear as we engage in politics or when our political party is not elected.
Yeah.
It's not the end of the world because that is not where our allegiance or our hope
Or our
ultimately
hope.
lies.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think for some people in the United States for whom they don't have that relationship with God or Jesus, that their hope as well as their identity has started to become intertwined with politics, such that it's quite devastating if politics don't go their way.
Yeah.
And it feels that in that case, it warrants extreme rhetoric and action because, yeah, if this is your hope and it was just snatched away from the other half of voters, oh, that doesn't feel good.
Yeah. I think of in particular the day after Donald Trump was elected.
Granted, as a conservative most of my life, I didn't find that nearly as upsetting as
Some
most
did.
of my colleagues and coworkers at the time.
Yeah. At the time, I was working at Boston University, and like at the university in Boston. I mean, Boston's already a pretty liberal place.
Yeah.
But the university is like the pinnacle of liberalism in Boston. So it was very upsetting for the majority of people at BU. I remember the day after going into work, and I heard maybe 2 people actually say something that day, and maybe a sentence or 2 each. I was mostly
it felt
silent.
like a funeral.
It very much felt like we were at a funeral for the United States.
Yeah.
Or something like that. At a funeral of some kind for something.
I recall distinctly having, I was so surprised that Donald Trump had won. And I remember thinking well, this is going to be an interesting next 4 years. Like, if nothing else, I was taking almost a comedic approach to, this will be different.
Yeah.
I wasn't devastated. And I don't think I would, well, I guess because I was anticipating Hillary Clinton was going to win.
Yeah.
I don't think my world would have been wrecked
destroyed then either.
by that outcome.
Yeah.
I would have been like, well, this will be an interesting 4 more years. Maybe not the direction I was kind of hoping things would go.
Yeah.
But we'll see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, so I will say with President Trump in particular, I am not a big fan of the guy. I've been pretty clear with you about that. But I think if we didn't live in the United States, I could have better understood maybe some of the fears and or concerns that people had. Because I think he's a megalomaniac, and that's one of my concerns with him. The good news is I think James Madison and many of the founding fathers were wise enough to put in some pretty serious constraints on any one executive officer's power.
Yes.
And so while had he had unlimited power, he may have done some things that were very self-serving. I think we were very fortunate that we lived in a government where that wasn't possible.
Right. Which I think is also why I don't find it as devastating when a Democrat is at the top of the ticket or in power, because I know that, well, there's Republicans in Congress and the Senate, and there's a system here that's not just going to let them roll out all of their campaign promises.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. When those promises are not policies you think are for the good of the country.
Right.
Which, again, getting back to why is it hard to talk about politics and the fact it's gotten so harder, if we can actually acknowledge that that really is what we think each person really is trying to achieve in the policies they're endorsing, is they think in their mind that they're trying to achieve something that's for the good of the country and
Right.
or for the people in the country or something. I think that's another key thing to bear in mind. And because if you aren't willing to acknowledge that, then you really can create a small micro camp of people who are just so evil that they really don't want what's good for the country.
Yeah.
They really do just want what's good for, I guess, for them and their like 10 friends or something.
Yeah.
But along those lines, I think another part of the frustration that people feel in that type of a context then is the fact that it is just two options. Right? Like,
It's a pretty binary choice.
It's a very binary choice.
You're like, A or B, there's no middle ground.
And many people often seem to describe feeling like neither is really that great,
Yes,
Yeah. And that's certainly how I felt in 2016. Like, as I said, I was not a big fan of Donald Trump. I was also not a big fan of Hillary Clinton. And so I didn't feel like I could vote strongly in either direction,
Yeah.
I think there's something you can say about the fact that like really you're voting for a party, not for a candidate.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there actually is some truth to that, because really what you're trying to do is, enact or gain a majority of controls of the levers in the government so that you can pass certain policies. And the policies are set by the party, not by individuals. I think there's some truth to that.
But it's tricky when the person representing those policies and the direction you might want the country to go is themselves not a great person.
Exactly, yeah.
That's really tricky.
It is.
Yeah.
Like, because when you're writing a person's name on a ballot or filling the box next to their name, it feels like you're saying, I agree with this person,
Yes.
they're a good person, even if that's not really what you're saying.
Right.
Or
It's like, oh, gross.
But anyway, I'll just comment from the mathematical side of things. I think there's been an increasing awareness in this ever since 2016, precisely because of this, that a big part of why we have only two parties is actually because of the voting system that we have, right? It's called first past the poll. Basically, you got to get 50% of the votes. And in a system like that, if you had a third party in there, it is absolutely in everyone's, in the system's interest that one of those two existing parties, or even if all three parties were evenly distributed, like they each have about 33% of the votes,
Mm-hmm.
it's still in the interest of all of those parties to figure out ways to kind of build an alliance, because the stronger of an alliance they build, the more likely it is that
They'll
they
draw crossover.
will win. Yeah, exactly. And so what ends up happening is those parties merge and become one party. And now you're back to two parties.
Right.
And you can work out the math. It's the same way no matter how many parties you put into the system, as long as you're using a first past the poll voting scheme. So it really doesn't matter, like if we need a third party. We do need a third party. You could argue we need a third party. Maybe it would more accurately be a representative system for people who feel stuck between Democrats and Republicans and don't feel like they're well aligned with either of them. But what we probably have to fix there is the voting. It's going to be a really big uphill battle if it were ever to happen. But I think if you did that, you actually could have some very viable third parties emerge, potentially.
So I think considering that is the system that we have, and it is a binary choice, and I don't think you need to think of your vote as an endorsement personally of the candidate.
Yeah.
I think it's tempting, perhaps, to just wash your hands of politics and be like, ugh, I just walk away.
With my upbringing and my engagement with politics, that is absolutely what I am tempted to do, right?
Sure.
Like, it's just so much easier to say,
Yes.
well, I guess I just won't engage, because both options are terrible.
Yeah.
And people just hate each other.
Yeah. But I guess I see my vote a little more strategically, the way that I cast it, such that there's a direction I think would be better for the country, and it's represented by this individual. And
or at least the platform
Mhm.
of that individual, or the platform of the party of
Right.
that individual.
While I might not agree with that person in their, I don't know, I might not consider them a moral person or somebody that you should look up to. And again, I think that's the nature of the system that we have. And so I don't know that I need to feel guilty for casting my vote that way, because that's the system that we have. And I feel strongly enough that I don't think the policies endorsed by the other side are helpful. That,
Yeah.
I'll cast that vote that way.
Even
also
if it's
gets-
not a perfect system.
Even if it's not a perfect system, it's the one we have. And
Yeah.
so we're going to work within it.
But at the end of the day, God has clearly asked his people, potentially at very high offices in the government, to engage with a clearly imperfect system,
Yes.
with emperors at the top, where they were advisors to those emperors, whether it's Joseph way back in Egypt or Daniel all the way forward in Babylon. God's asked his people to engage with that civic life
Right.
and do it a good service.
Do a good job. Think about the issues, cast your vote.
Well, for us, it's cast our vote.
Right.
Because of the system we live in. We're kind of closer to Daniel's position in that
Yeah,
regard.
that's
We
true.
have
That's interesting.
influence on the government
Yeah.
in a way that many of God's people didn't in the past. But we have examples from Scripture where God does ask his people to do that. But at the same time, it's those same examples where their ultimate allegiance is very clearly to the Lord, to his kingdom. And hopefully, as Christians at the very least, that should pave us a little bit of a way forward toward being able to talk about politics and religion cogently and kindly and respectfully,
And engage in politics.
and to find a way to engage without feeling like you're stuck with no options.
Right.
You have to disengage. I love you.
I love you too.
Thanks for talking politics
Yeah, thanks for picking a topic that
that you like.
I like and spend a lot of my time thinking about.
Thanks for sticking around for this bonus episode of All Truth is God's Truth. We would like to help as many Christians as possible grow deeper in their faith. So if you benefited from this episode, consider sharing it with a friend and leaving a 5-star review at Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your audio. You could also consider following us at facebook.com/ATIGT podcasts, where we'll be releasing a series of posts aimed at helping Christians understand the cultural and historical background of the Bible. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.